Hey there, I'm Kavita Kalsi from Devex. We're here at the European Development Days in Brussels. I'm here with Matthias Schmale of the Red Cross, the undersecretary-general. Matthias, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about the Red Cross's perspective on the post-2015 development agenda. So please tell me, what are your feelings on that?
Let me start by saying, well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. Let me start by saying we've just had our General Assembly, which takes place every 2 years with our 189 now national member organizations. And we spent quite some time at that assembly discussing what the Red Cross's view is of the post-2015 Millennium Development Agenda and came up with a declaration at the end of it. The basic thrust is that, or some of the key messages are, number one, we acknowledge that much has been achieved under the current MDGs. I think we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah.
The fight against HIV, for example, has made a significant progress under the current. So we need to build on that. That should not be forgotten. There should be continuity there.
It's true that we often talk about what hasn't been achieved, but it's true that it's good to...
There's a lot that has been achieved. There's also lots that hasn't been achieved. So, for example, we've had enormous progress on primary education, but there's enormous imbalance between boys and girls, as an example. So, but yes, it is a question of the glass is half full and half empty. It's not just a negative story and not just a positive one. Looking into the future, we are hoping that the next sustainable development agenda post-2015 will consider a couple of key aspects from the Red Cross perspective, one of which is the strengthening of resilience as an important theme. We think it is important to strengthen individuals, their communities, organizations and countries in terms of their resilience to withstand, cope with and recover from shocks, disasters. Because we've found over the years that big disasters such as the typhoon we're seeing in the Philippines throws back development gains. So we think that there needs to be an explicit part of a future development agenda that looks at protecting development gains by looking at preparing for and responding properly to disasters and strengthening the resilience of the most high-risk communities and people living there. A second bit is that we really think the current Millennium Development Agenda was more or less a top-down approach. What is really important is that we anchor development thinking and commitment to goals at local levels. We had Amina Mohammed with us at our General Assembly. She is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for this development agenda, and she was very much giving the same message. Let's stop talking about a global agenda, let's really anchor it locally. And for us that means it brings in the aspect of volunteers. If we really want to reach the most vulnerable at high-risk communities, we must build on fantastic networks of volunteers that exist. Within the Red Cross, Red Crescent, we have 15 million active volunteers. You know, that's a tremendous workforce, if I may say it like that. So if we want to bring developmental activity to scale, we are asking the world, as it agrees a new development agenda, to explicitly consider the role of volunteers as a significant part of civil society and as a significant avenue for reaching scale. And then maybe a final point to make is that we also feel it's important that we don't just have high-level goals. As I said, they need to be anchored in local realities, but that they are achievable and measurable. And in the declaration that came out of our General Assembly, we made a number of specific suggestions to our national organizations. And let me highlight one of them, which is that we're saying in order to protect development gains, we should look into having each and every community or household with at least one trained up person in disaster preparedness and response, with disaster preparedness and response skills. And that could be simple, basic first aid, for example. Now, you can only achieve that if you look at volunteers again. We would really make a significant contribution if we, as Red Cross, Red Crescent, but also other volunteer-based organizations, worked towards a goal like that. Have in each and every vulnerable community, in particular, a trained-up person that can help that community prepare for potential risks and disasters and cope with them.
Very interesting. On the volunteer theme, would you say as well, because you talked about you at Red Cross, Red Crescent, and then other volunteer-based organizations really mobilizing that resource. But would you also say there's a message for other development actors who might not really engage that much with local volunteers, so consultancies and then maybe other NGOs that don't employ or interact that much with volunteers, that there's really a need for them to do so in order to connect more with the community and ensure that development is sustainable.
I think that's a spot-on question and observation, in fact. My main point on this would be, I think many NGOs are community-based but run projects not always to scale. So if you want your very good work that many NGOs do to reach scale across a huge number of communities, you need to work with volunteers. There is no way, starting from a cost efficiency point of view, that you can reach the necessary scale if we want to have sustainable development through paid staff. You need volunteer staff, you need the access to the most vulnerable communities, and that, from our experience, one key avenue for doing so is working with volunteers. And I think the other point to make here is we often talk about Red Cross, Red Crescent volunteers. The reality is that no one owns volunteers. Volunteers are people who want to do good in their own community, and one day they may work for a Red Cross initiative, the next day they may be involved in Save the Children work. So I want to be clear that we don't own volunteers, none of us do. All of us, including other NGOs and civil society actors, need to see them as valuable partners and a resource in their development.
Right. And it's also a way to engage more actively with local communities, as well as having the human resource there to help with projects and to deliver messages and increase resilience. It's also a great way to engage.
Absolutely. In our experience, volunteers are critical if you want to build ownership and participation. Because again, most of the volunteers we work with are local volunteers, so they live and work in their own community. And if you can engage them, you will engage their community with them and build a higher degree of participation and ownership. But also they help to reach vulnerable groups much better than any agency can. And the example I quite often use is one that struck me when visiting South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, a few years ago, when the South African government made antiretroviral drugs available. There were a lot of vulnerable people in remote rural communities in particular who didn't know how to access the drugs. So the drugs were there, but it required quite a bit of dealing with bureaucracy to register, and to get access to these drugs. And South African Red Cross volunteers did nothing else but connect vulnerable people with the bureaucracy of the state, and thus in this way gave them access to the antiretroviral drugs. So it wasn't just about providing the drugs, it was about making sure that people who really needed them accessed them, and the volunteers played a critical role in that.
Excellent. Well, it's a really great message. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll talk more off camera. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.